Hi, everybody, and welcome to part 2 of the fourth module in the semester, the fourth chapter on audio media. In this particular video, we talk about radio. Now, if I had the time, I could spend hours talking about each and every individual item that I have plucked from your readings to discuss in this particular little video. But I'm just going to highlight a few that I think are important for you to understand and to know a little bit about. So let's jump in. Radio functions, consistent with what we've been discussing since the chapter on developing critical media skills, critical learning skills relative to media. Radio functions often align with those of the music industry and some of the print media we've described earlier. So, of course, radio provides an entertainment function in society. More important, perhaps, both in the United States as well as in other countries, radio provides a news and surveillance function. Ours is a media system I might have mentioned in earlier videos that is largely dependent upon advertiser support in order to pay the freight, in order to pay salaries, in order to pay for the transmission of the printing or whatever the medium is that we're talking about. In many countries globally, people pay more money as citizens in that country to support public broadcasting, where the news and information about what's going on in government are seen as a central part of the news function. And of course, we have that too in terms of news format, broadcast stations, internet stations, or internet streaming feeds. We also have that, of course, in terms of public radio, the few that listen to that. Radio in our country is a huge marketing enterprise, so we'll talk a little bit more about that when we discuss a couple of the major milestones in radio. And any of us who live in Southern Nevada, and if you're watching this video and you don't live in Southern Nevada, chances are where you live, you had strange weather of late, and you know that radio often provides an important emergency announcement function as part of FCC requirements for all broadcasters who have licenses. Radio is the most heavily used medium in the United States, and that needs to be qualified because most of the time when we're listening to radio, we're doing something else. The most valuable day parts in radio in terms of advertising costs are morning and afternoon drive time. That's what it's called, and that's because you and I are listening to our favorite talk show or our favorite music station, or we're punching the scan button and listening to a couple of those different formats as we drive in the morning and afternoon. Radio is also the most widely used medium globally, frankly, because it's cheaper than newspapers for most people. Not everyone can read in the world. And radio programming and radio broadcasting is cheaply produced and cheaply propagated, cheaply propagated. I was right the first time. In terms of ability to get the message out there. And radio receivers tend to be quite cheap too. So radio is a predominant medium globally. Okay, a few things about radio history, and this primarily has to do with the United States and regulatory environments. This is a large section in your chapter with lots of detail, and I had to pick and choose some things I wanted to highlight here. You're going to read about Marconi. You're going to read about wireless telegraphy. You're going to read about early radio globally, now about 110, 113 years old. Roughly late 19th century, late 19th century. Actually started in Italy, went on into Great Britain, and then came over here. Early radio transmission was simply the ability to transmit a signal and not transmit a signal. So early radio telegraphy or wireless telegraphy was simply, I'm going to turn on my transmitter and broadcast, and I'm going to take my finger off the transmission key, and I'm not going to send anything at all. So you have in early wireless telegraphy, you simply have on-off signals. And as a result, people like Morse Samuel Morse came along and developed code for us to basically communicate through a series of on and off signals, and it's obviously known as the Morse code, and it is still something that is practiced by seagoing vessels, or it's a backup for people in communications today when everything else fails. Radio evolved to a point where there was continuous wave radio. So instead of turning on and off a transmitter, we would turn transmitters on, and then we learned how to lay a signal or a carrier wave. By transmitting a carrier wave, we learned how to modulate that carrier wave to duplicate on an analog level. We talked about that with the recording industry, on an analog level, voice and music. Okay, and the first techniques utilized something called amplitude modulation, and along in the 20s and 30s came along Edwin Armstrong, who developed frequency modulation, which was far superior in terms of quality of sound and less noise in terms of the transmission. So you're going to read about the pioneers who advanced on-off signal to actually our ability to transmit voices and sound and music, and be able to decipher that and listen to that in radios in our homes. You're also going to read about the increase in regulation. Actually, the precursor to the FCC was involved in the 20s and 30s as radio began to explode in this country, and more people were getting into radio. And you can imagine in communities where you had all these pioneers or people who like to tinker with this stuff, they were beginning to crowd out the electromagnetic spectrum in their little markets, and there was chaos in the airwaves. So the precursor to the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, had to get involved and basically begin to organize this spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, and assign people to particular frequencies that wouldn't bang into each other when they were transmitting signals. So, and along with World War I and also World War II, you saw the development of increasing regulation, because as this medium grew, people were concerned about this medium falling into the wrong hands. And so it was not unusual, for example, in the First World War, or during the First World War, where the government took over essentially what was going on in terms of radio in America. You'll also talk or read about the birth of commercial broadcasting in the 1920s. And this is an important notion to understand, because when David Sarnoff began to develop what became NBC, the National Broadcasting Company, he was looking for ways to pay for this. And as he began to put programming together, people who would sing, movie stars who were making the transition over to radio, folks from vaudeville who were beginning to develop program length shows, variety shows, dramas, soap operas, that kind of thing. David Sarnoff was looking for ways to pay for this. And he ultimately arrived at the conclusion that what I can do is I can charge people who want to sponsor these programs money, and that will pay for the programming. And that ultimately evolved into endorsements, product endorsements, and sales pitches for these various products and services made by manufacturers who wanted to advertise. Those pitches were blended into the programs themselves. We now bring you so-and-so and so-and-so during the Texaco Star Hour variety show, that kind of thing. And so it was actually David Sarnoff who we hold responsible for monetizing and creating a system where ultimately advertisers paid for the majority of the freight in the media as we know it in terms of broadcasting, radio, and television. It's a system that's not unheard of globally. It started here. It is not the predominant system globally in terms of how traditionally broadcasting has been paid for in many, many countries, including countries, Western culture countries like Great Britain or regions like Great Britain, France, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, and so on and so forth. A lot of radio regulation to talk about in this chapter as well. And so you're going to see the various developments over time that created the FCC. And I'm really kind of culminating my talk here by just discussing one that was kind of landmark for what it did and for what it eliminated. So later on in your readings in the regulation area, you're going to read about the Telecommunications Act of 1996. This actually occurred during the William Jefferson Clinton administration, but it was a culmination of non-regulation or deregulation efforts that began with the Reagan administration, the Ronald Reagan administration in the 1980s. Up to 1996, there were limits on the number of radio stations, television stations as well, that an individual could own. And much of this harkens back to the Communications Act of 1934, which you'll also read about. And in the Communications Act of 1934, Congress was heavily influenced at the time by natural resource conservation philosophies. They were establishing park systems in this country. And they bought heavily into the notion that the electromagnetic spectrum, which you'll read about, was a natural resource and therefore must be regulated and must be protected and preserved. And the Communications Act of 1934 said that radio operators need to operate in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. That's a very famous clause, public interest, convenience, and necessity clause. And what it basically meant was that people who have a license to broadcast, while being profitable, they owe something to their publics. They owe something to their communities. And so they must be mindful to be sure to provide programming that is of local interest, to provide a clearinghouse for controversial issues of the day, to provide an opportunity for different voices on a particular topic or political issue, airtime so that they could express those views. Well, broadcasters have never liked the public interest, convenience, and necessity clause or its corresponding regulatory practices. And so they've been fighting it for decades. And they were successful in influencing the Reagan administration to begin to get rid of ownership regulations, for example. And so broadcasters, up to a certain point, were only allowed to have so many stations in this country. And this began to fall apart in the 80s and culminated in the 90s with the Telco Act of 96. And the Telco Act of 96 eliminated ownership rules. And the result is what we have today in terms of radio. We no longer have smaller groups of stations owned by individuals or groups or corporate groups. We now have basically one, if you will, maybe two large radio group owners in this country. And the result, of course, is a homogenization of radio content. You and I can drive across this country now, and as we reach various markets with our radio station on the interstate highways, we're going to hear the same formats, the same music, the same rotations in music, because all those stations are largely owned by the same major corporations. So there's a homogenization, there's a sameness, if you will, to radio programming today that doesn't serve local interests. And personally, I believe that's a shame. And we've also talked about ownership concentration and how really one or two large corporations are now calling most of the shots. So those are some of the major issues that you're going to encounter as you read this chapter. Radio is a fascinating industry. We always have students in our program who are interested in radio. We have courses in radio production. We have courses in radio management. There are things that students who have a particular passion for the radio industry can pursue within their major in our program. That's it. I hope you enjoy reading this chapter, and we'll get back to you when we talk in Chapter 5. Thanks so much.